Well, hi everybody. Well, today we are going to begin the second phase of our series called Trifecta, in which we are looking at 3 short New Testament letters that each have 3 chapters. Now, if you've been following along with us so far, you know that we just completed the letter of 2 Peter, in which the Apostle Peter is addressing the churches that he was working with regarding a false teaching that was getting around. And the teaching was, or the ideology was, that Jesus was not really going to return, so therefore morality didn't really matter all that much. Well, while one group was teaching that Jesus was never really coming back, another group was teaching several churches in the region that Jesus had already returned. So as you can see, that even in the first century church, there was a lot of bad teaching going around outside of the apostles that were just getting around and confusing a lot of people. Now today we're going to look at the letter of 2 Thessalonians. That's who Paul is addressing about this teaching that Jesus had already returned. And to them it was a big deal because they were very anxious about the return of Jesus and they expected it to happen at any time. So to be told that they missed it, that was really troubling for them. Now, to give us a little bit of background on the church of Thessalonica, you can look at Acts, the book of Acts in chapter 17, and you find that Paul and his ministry partners Silas and their new protege that they picked up, named Timothy, began planting churches. And they had, just before this, planted a church in Philippi. And then when they kind of got run out of town, they ended up in Thessalonica and began planting a church there. Now, this church was unique. It did have some Jewish Christians, but it also had many Greek believers who had left a life of idol worship in order to follow Jesus, this new teaching that Paul and Silas were going around and teaching about, this new Jesus and the resurrection. In addition to these Greek believers, they also had many believers who were prominent, influential women. And so there was a very unique makeup of this church. But another distinctive characteristic of this particular body of believers is that they were extremely passionate for and even anxious about the return of Jesus. In fact, they seemed to be almost obsessed with the details of the second coming. They believed that it would happen at any moment. One of the concerns that the Thessalonians had, Paul addressed in the first letter to the Thessalonians. And that concern was, what about those who had already died? Would they somehow miss out on the return of Jesus? Would they be at some kind of disadvantage? Would they not get to enjoy the same wonderful eternal benefits that those who were living would get to enjoy? And Paul answered that in a very emphatic way, saying, absolutely not. In fact, he says, those who have died in the Lord will be the first ones that Jesus calls back to himself when he returns. And then all the rest who are still alive when that great event happens will be called up to him afterwards. In fact, if you kind of think about this, it's sort of like if someone you know and love, a family member, is coming to visit and they haven't seen you or you haven't seen them for a long time and they pull in your driveway, what do? Well, you don't just stand at the door and wait for them to walk up your front porch or what have you. You actually go out to meet them in the driveway because you've been waiting for them for so long. That's the picture that Paul painted in 1 Thessalonians chapter 4. But maybe even another better, more first century image would be that of a Roman triumphant procession. A Roman procession was a big parade thrown for a Roman general or even a Caesar who had a great battle victory. And what would happen is that they would ride in, they actually would oftentimes ride in on a carriage pulled by white horses. Every once in a while they would actually just be riding a white horse. But the townspeople, instead of waiting for him to come into town, or the whole procession to come into town, they would actually go out and meet the procession and then walk into the town with him. And that's the image that Paul created in 1 Thessalonians 4 for the Thessalonians. Now the Thessalonians are really excited and they're really anxious about this. And so anytime they hear talk of the second coming, their ears perk up. So much so that they actually, to a fault, many of them quit their jobs because they were waiting for this return and thought it would happen at any moment. And then, of course, when it didn't, they began to have needs that needed to be met because, hey, we still have to eat and live. But they no longer had their jobs because they quit their jobs. And this added pressure onto those who hadn't quit, who kept making a living. And so Paul will address that problem in the last chapter of 2 Thessalonians. However, the bigger issue he needs to address at the moment is the fake news that Jesus had already returned and that they somehow had missed him. This was very troubling for a church who was emphatically eager about the return of Jesus. How in the world, in their minds, could they have missed this? Well, two things become very clear in this letter. First, that even then, there were those preaching about a secret return or a secret day of Jesus, the day of the Lord, that others apparently would miss. Paul squashed that idea in this response. But the second part that becomes clear, that when you allow certain teachers to begin taking things like the second coming and the details surrounding that event and taking those things out of the context in which they are taught or written, unfortunately you kind of become susceptible to believing just about anything. Even an event like the second coming that won't be missed by anyone, especially when people are sitting there telling you that, oh, it already happened. No, you'll know when it happens. In another one of those most misunderstood and misapplied scriptures in the New Testament, Paul will remind the church that there was also, at least the Thessalonian church, that there was also one major significant event that had to take place before Jesus returned. An event that everyone in that region would know about, and there's no way anyone in that region could miss. But we'll get to that in the next session. For today, I want us to look at chapter 1, however. After opening with a similar greeting as 1 Thessalonians, Paul and Silas and Timothy, who are writing this letter together, compliment the church on two characteristics that, in spite of the confusion that they were dealing with, and in spite of all the questions they had, somehow they still managed to excel in faith and mutual love for one another. Now, when you think about it, confusion often easily becomes a distraction to faith. And also, confusion will sometimes lead to arguing and infighting and so forth. So arguing and fighting, of course, lead into love just kind of being set aside and forgotten about. But this church, in spite of their confusion, in spite of all the challenging questions and even the persecution they were dealing with, they managed to keep excelling in faith and in mutual love. And that goes to their credit. That's an incredible accomplishment. You know, it's not an accident that Paul would include these two elements, faith and mutual love, together. Because faith and love for one another feed each other. As a person's faith grows, so does their ability and willingness to love even the most difficult people in the most difficult circumstances. And the more that brotherly love grows, the more a person's faith will grow. In fact, you might remember Peter talked about that in the first chapter of his letter, 2 Peter, that we looked at a few weeks ago. Well, these two virtues working together make for a powerful combination. Together, for example, they increase a believer's capacity for perseverance and persistence when facing resistance from those who oppose us. You know why? Because they remind us that we are not alone in the battle or in the journey. In the Old Testament, for example, after defeating those who resisted God in an epic, dramatic fashion, Elijah felt like giving up and just kind of giving in because he felt all alone. And then God reminded him that there were 7,000 other people in the area who had not bent a knee to the false god, who were still faithful. And having knowledge that there was still indeed a community of believers who were just as faithful as he was, gave Elijah the strength to go on. When your faith and your love grow together, it also invites praise from those who are in spiritual authority over you. For the Thessalonians, who were undergoing opposition from the very beginning and increasing persecution both from Jewish people and from Gentile, from the Greeks, and without any kind of protection from the Roman government, to hear their fathers in the faith, to hear Paul and Silas and Timothy tell them that they were proud of their growth and their accomplishments would have been a tremendous encouragement to them. You know, the kid of the 80s, one of my favorite movies is the movie Top Gun. Now, I'm sure many of you are familiar with this movie, but for those of you who aren't, Top Gun is a movie about the top Navy fighter pilots in training to win an award called the Top Gun Award. And in this movie, Tom Cruise plays a character named Maverick, who is kind of neck and neck in battle with another pilot for this Top Gun award. Unfortunately, due to a tragic accident and the guilt that he felt from that accident, and the fact that it killed his what they call radar intercept officer, or RIO, who happened to also be his best friend, he kind of lost confidence and he wasn't quite the same person anymore. Yet he still managed to graduate, but he certainly did not win the Top Gun award. However, at the graduation ceremony and celebration, as they were all celebrating, some of these pilots got called immediately to emergency duty, including Maverick. And as they're handing out the assignments, the instructor of the whole school tells Maverick, hey, Maverick, when you get to your ship, you'll get your RIO, your radar intercept officer. And then he says to him this, but if you don't, give me a call. I'll fly with you. You know, those kind of words from someone that you look up to and who are in authority over you mean more to you than any kind of trophy on a mantle or plaque on a wall. And that's exactly the feeling, I'm sure, that the Thessalonians had when Paul told them just how proud he was of their faith and mutual love. But perhaps the most powerful effect of faith and mutual love working together is how it inspires other people to action, especially other churches and Jesus followers. That's why Paul says that they boast about the Thessalonians to the other churches they worked with, sort of in hopes of spurring what we might call a healthy envy, because once they see that other churches can accomplish this and other churches can fight through all the suffering and the challenges, it inspires them to do the same thing. Paul knows that the goodness that arises out of faith and love and perseverance and persistence will inspire these other churches to be just as determined and just as zealous amid persecution if they know that there's another group of people who are just as resolute and steadfast. As resolute, though, as the Thessalonian people were, you can imagine their shock and their disappointment and their confusion when they were told by some teachers who claimed to be in league with Paul that Jesus had already returned and they just missed it. That would really be shocking and confusing to their understanding of what the return of Jesus would look like. But with a persuasive enough teacher added to already great anticipation and the fact that Paul said Jesus would return like a thief in the night, it's not hard to see how they might have fell for this kind of teaching. But at the heart of their concern and of their confusion would be this question: where is the justice in that? For all that they had endured at the hand of others, how in the world could it be possible that Jesus would skip over them? It wouldn't be right, it wouldn't be just for God to let them suffer only to be ignored, or worse yet, rejected in the second coming. But even more, if Jesus had returned, why were there still evil people in the world? Why were there still evil in the world? Why was Rome still able to exploit and rule over nations with an iron fist? Well, while reassuring them that Jesus hadn't returned yet, at the same time, Paul takes the rest of this chapter to talk about God's sense of justice and how it played into their circumstances that they were living in right then, as well as how this justice will play out in the end. It actually kind of involves two different aspects of God's justice. In one short, subtle comment, he declares that what they are currently going through is actually evidence of God's righteous justice. Now that must have been as confusing for them to hear as it is for you and I to read. How is it just that those that are faithful followers of Jesus should suffer things such as social discrimination or relational rejection or even physical harm as a result of their faith? How can Paul claim that this is evidence of God's righteous judgment? It seems like that would be the perfect time to question God and wonder how following him is any more beneficial than not following him. Maybe the best way to think about, though, what Paul's saying here is to think of it in terms or in the framework of a military boot camp. You know, when a new recruit arrives to boot camp, he or she may be the nicest man or woman in the entire place. They may even be trying to do their very best to do everything they're being trained to do, but yet the drill sergeant may still lead them through some very difficult challenges and, might we even say, some suffering in their training. Now, is that justice? Is that right? Well, if you're just thinking in terms of social interaction, then no, it wouldn't be just or right. But if the end goal is to make them fully prepared for the battlefield, then by all means it would be considered just and righteous. The suffering they go through is the catalyst through which they prove their worthiness as soldiers. In the same way, Paul said, the ability of a follower of Jesus to withstand and endure tribulation, whether it comes at the hand of others, or through tough life circumstances, or by way of natural disasters, or even deadly pandemics, and yet maintain faithfulness and mutual love in spite of their suffering, actually proves their worthiness to be a follower and eventually a leader in the kingdom of God. Now, our experiences also elevate our individual resolve. Our resolve helps us to develop a thick skin, spiritually speaking, enabling us to withstand Satan's attacks. And our scars give us the credibility to lead others in the battlefield, spiritually speaking. And again, also by doing it together as a community, much like a soldier in a platoon, it also tests and validates our interdependence upon one another. It's one thing to be cordial and nice and gentle and peaceful and loving and kind when things are easy, but it's quite another to do those things and to maintain mutual love in the middle of such difficulty. It becomes easier to have an every man for himself mentality in the midst of trying circumstances. But when we stay reliant on one another through the difficult circumstances, we become the realization and the answer to the prayer of Jesus that he prayed in John 17 about all of us being one. That we would always be one people in spite of whatever we suffered. That we would always be faithful and mutually love one another. And one other thing that going through suffering does, and this recent pandemic has revealed, is that it sparks our ingenuity. It was never meant for us as kingdom citizens to maintain stagnant worship. Adaptation and change and ingenuity should be a natural part of our spiritual DNA as Christians and as a church. You know, sometimes God disguises his intentions and the next move that he wants us to make in the form of uncomfortable situations. In Acts chapter 8, verses 9, for example, God used a persecution to scatter the church into other parts of the world to spread the message. He would do it again in 70 AD through the destruction of Jerusalem. Recently, many churches who have historically resisted during online services reconsidered their strategies and their resistance because of the pandemic. So yes, many times God does use unique and even trying circumstances to move his church in a new direction. God gifted us with the creativity, and he expects us to use it for the advancement of the kingdom. So yes, for these reasons and many others, his judgments and his decisions are righteous, even when he allows situations that result in suffering and hardship among his people, because it makes us stronger and more resilient and better. But Paul doesn't want the Thessalonians or us to forget that God's justice and judgment will also become evident when he ultimately judges the world at the end of the age, which will happen at the return of Christ. Although he doesn't go into explicit detail here, Paul does reveal the devastatingly sad state of those who will experience God's wrath. It's interesting that Paul said that those who will feel this vengeance will not only be those who reject God altogether or just don't believe in him, but also those who fail to obey the gospel of Jesus. Remember, Jesus said that there will be many who claim to know and follow him, but because their lives were characterized by compromise and hypocrisy and disobedience and a failure to love and put that love in action, he will not recognize them. And as a result, all these groups of people will spend eternity away from the presence of God. In an environment where the presence of God is completely absent, there will be no trace of love, no trace of peace or contentment or comfort. Think about that for a moment. Try to imagine what an existence without even the very presence of love would look like. Can't even imagine that. Even in the worst of circumstances in this world, there is still always some semblance of love and kindness present. But without the presence of God, love cannot exist. The realities of that kind of eternal existence are unimaginable. How sad that so many will choose that road that leads to that end. But for those who do follow and obey and endure through the trials and the tribulations for the cause of Christ, they will be the instruments through whom God will be glorified. We will marvel at his presence when we witness what will be the unveiling, or an incredible unveiling of Jesus that no one has yet seen. What an incredible day that will be. Paul reassures his readers that they haven't missed anything. They won't miss it. They can't miss it. And besides that, in their time, there was something that everyone in the early church knew had to take place before the return of Jesus. And that event had not happened yet. And Paul will get into that into the next chapter. But for now, his encouragement for us, and my encouragement for you, is to remember that the days we are living in will come to pass, including this pandemic. Our trials and our tribulations are only a moment in time, and they become evidence that we are indeed worthy of the call that has been placed on our lives if we remain faithful. So, in the meantime, stay faithful, stay safe, and let's stay connected. I love you guys.